Okay, so what do I want to talk about? So yeah, I mean, I tried to leave it out of the title of the slide. I actually had to go in and remove it. But yeah, so this is mostly about Angular. So sorry for hardcore Node fans. But it's all JavaScript, right? So okay, so what do I want to talk about? Declaratively synchronizing form controls with the URL. So just real quick, so Christoph just introduced me. My name is Ingo. I work for TNG. You can also find me on GitHub, blah, 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 and so on. So let's get to it. So what is this about? What this is really about is about being reentrant, right? So what do I mean with that? I assume everyone here has seen a website before, and maybe even websites that do things where you like can filter or whatever. And so the question is, have any of these things ever annoyed you when you visited a website? You reload a page, and what you have entered has gone. You navigated and you wanted to go back, and everything you entered is gone. You want to share what you see on the page with your friends or your coworkers, whatever, but you copied the URL, and when you open the URL, everything is gone. Or lastly, you want to bookmark the URL because it's just so damn interesting, but if you go to that bookmark, everything is gone. So we have this state in websites that we somehow want to make sure that it reappears, right? So simple examples are search machines like Google, whatever, or e-commerce websites where you can search for something, administrative, like monitoring kind of websites, like I don't know, I use Datadog, for example, where you can like set filters and that kind of stuff and queries, and you somehow want to make sure that if you do any of these things, you get the same state again. You don't have to start from scratch, putting everything back in. And this sounds like a really simple problem, and it has been solved for a long time. In theory, I mean, you know, Google has been able to do this forever. And there's a bunch of different solutions that you can think of. So one solution is you can just not care, but this is not, then the talk would be very short, so we don't want to do that. You could use cookies. You could use local storage or session storage, or you could use a database. And all of these are not ideal, partially for the same reasons. For example, sharing or bookmarking will not work if you use anything that's local to your machine, like local storage, or cookies also wouldn't work if you want to share it with other people. And database, a lot of the time, is just really overkill, right? So just because I selected that I want to see women's shoes, you know, that's not necessarily something I want to store in the database every single time. So all of these are not really what we're looking for. So there is a solution, and that solution is pretty obvious, and you all know it because you all use it, and it's called query parameters, right? So what is the idea? We have a little like search website, and we type something in that we want to search by. We hit enter, and what happens is, oh, do I have a pointer? Yeah, sort of. Okay, so what happens is we just append this parameter to the URL that actually reflects what we're searching for, and based on that, my app changes. And now, if I take this URL and I just do whatever with it, I can reload it, I can share it, I can bookmark it, I will get the same thing again. So it's a pretty simple solution. But, okay, I'm not going to make the case for Angular here, but for a simple solution, it's surprisingly difficult to do with Angular. So how does it work, right? So what do we do? So we have the URL and we have our UI, and we somehow want to synchronize the state from the URL into the UI, right? So the URL changes, or when you go to the URL, we want the UI to reflect what you have put there. I go to this website that I just mentioned. I want the text box to be filled with space. At the same time, we want to do the reverse as well, right? So when I change the UI, when I type into my search field, I want the URL to update. And that's nice, and now I have it synchronized. The only problem is there's a third component missing, and that third component is the backend. I actually want to do something with the stuff that I enter, right? I mean, I want to actually update my search results. So there is sort of a choice to be made here, and that is whether the UI or the URL dictates this. And in my little graph here, I choose the URL as the source of truth. And you can make either choice, but that's the choice that I make. So in Angular, this is very similar to code that I've seen and also written myself to achieve this kind of stuff. So what do we have? We have like some input field, and we track the current value, and we say, okay, the value is like this string. And whenever the user types, what we do is we don't actually update the value directly, but instead when they type, we navigate to this updated URL. And then we also listen for the changes here on the URL and update our state from that. So that way we actually get this flow, right? So typing changes the URL, a changing URL changes our state. And everything works, but this looks awful. So imagine doing this for every single input field. Doesn't make you happy. So a slightly different way we can do this, but again, this is also pretty awful, is we just use sort of like a getter here, and we actually don't keep the state directly in our component, but instead always access it from the URL. So this makes it look a little bit prettier, but it's the same and it's still awful. So this was a very simple example of I want one text field to be synchronized with the URL. It was already awfully long, very boilerplatey. It doesn't even yet solve our problem of we need to somehow attach this to a backend. And there's a bunch of problems that if you really write this kind of code, you will run into very quickly. So for example, debouncing, right? When I type, I don't want to go to the server for every single keystroke. Default values. So if you have like some filter dropdown, like to filter by status, then maybe if there's nothing in the URL, you want a certain status to be pre-selected. Pagination is a very good case. So you have your list and you want to memorize like on which page in this list you're at, so that when you refresh, you're on the same page. But you might have additional cases there where when the data refreshes, you want to go back to page 1, and so on and so on. And a bunch of more problems. So a while ago, this got me thinking, in Angular, so I don't know how many people here know Angular, but in Angular, when you do forms, you have basically two different implementations of forms in Angular, the normal, like template-driven forms and the reactive forms. And the API looks something like this. So in your model, you define a model, a form group, where you set up what you want your form to look like. So I say I have a group that contains one field, which is and a control with an empty string as the value. And then you bind this group to some parent. And now you can reference the control inside of it called search text by just binding the form control name to this. And now what the forms module will do for you is it will keep the state from what you have in the input with the state in this abstract form model in sync, right? So this is what the forms module does for you. And this is a pretty nice and simple API, and it's declarative, and I don't have to worry about how this works, it just does. And then I was thinking from that, so what if I can do the same thing? Like it's the same thing. It's about some kind of input control and synchronizing state, just that I want to synchronize it with the URL. So if we just replace a few names, right? So we rename form group to queryperineum group. We rename this form builder to queryperineum builder, and just a bunch of different words. And structurally, it's exactly the same. What if it could work like this? Like that would be sweet. And I sat down and I actually liked this idea so much that I just started writing this, and actually turns out this is exactly how you can do it, right? So what I ended up writing is ngqp, which is a library for Angular. And just to go back to this, this is exactly what it will look like in ngqp. So the really nice bonus effect that you get here in Angular is this is what Angular developers already know. This is what they're familiar with. Now they can do this to solve a similar but different problem, and the API is essentially exactly the same. So the overhead of learning yet another library, yet another API is very small, because you really just replace one word with the other and everything works the same. So it's time for a little demo. So I do have a little bit of Node. So I explicitly didn't start this because I start a server with Node. So this just spins up a tiny REST server. And then I essentially have like, is this big enough? Yeah. I have a little Angular application here, which is just some fake like hotel search kind of website, and I should refresh it because now the server's there, right? So I have a bunch of different hotels. Right. Never mind the design box. And here I can do things like search for a hotel. So I can search for this hotel and it works. Or I can search for certain amenities or whether it should be smoking or not. So like this kind of stuff. And now we have exactly the issue that I mentioned. I refresh this and boom, everything is gone and I'm sad. So the way this currently works is pretty straightforward. We just use this forms module to bind everything. Just as an example, here we bind with ngmodel the search text. And whenever it changes, we just refresh the list. It's not ideally textbook, but a lot of the times that's how you would find it. And then you just make the API request and voila. So how can we update this to use ngqp? So I'm just going to cancel off this. So using the Angular schematics, all we have to do is actually let me show you. So right now, well, just a line break change. So we have a clean git diff. And all we have to do now is we add ngqp core. So we could do a yarn install. That's fine, but then we have to do some setup ourselves, and developers don't like doing setup. So we use the Angular schematics. And with schematics, we basically allow to not just install the package, but also actually make changes to the code. So good thing the internet is fast. Talk about bundling taking long. OK, so now we just ran this one command. And if we look, we see that our package has actually been added. But more than that, we actually also see that the module has been imported and everything has been set up. And we don't need to do anything else. It's just ready now. So I'm just going to ngserve this again. OK, so now, of course, we have ngqp available. And now we just have to use it, right? So we do exactly what I mentioned before. We create this queryperineum group. We have to get our builder. And we start setting this up. So we create a group. And we want to mirror these inputs that we have. So we start, for example, with the search text. I'm going to try to make this a bit quicker and not type everything out by hand. So right now we have the search text here, and we want to switch it to use ngqp. So what we create is a control. And the search text is, of course, a text field. So this is a string parameter. And what you have to tell ngqp is what's the actual parameter that you want to use on the URL, right? So it has to be stored in some parameter. And so for search strings, Q is a pretty common standard, so we can't just do that. And now we replace this ngModel with queryperineum. This is called search text, and we have to make sure we just provide this group somewhere on the parent. As long as it's a parent, it doesn't matter where it is. So we do this. And assuming I didn't mess anything up, we can now see when I type, it updates the URL instantly. And likewise, if I refresh with that URL, then the fields will remain filled in, right? So cool. So it was that simple. And now we can extend this with additional configuration. So for example, the one case that I mentioned is search fields. We want to somehow debounce them. So we can do just that by providing a debounce time. Let's make it 1 second, so it's pretty obvious. Yeah, keep switching to the wrong one. OK. And now when I change this, you see it actually takes 1 second before the URL changes, and I can type fast, and it happens all at once. So, and the nice thing about this, again, is it's a declarative thing, right? So as the developer, I don't care how it works. I just tell it what to do, and it does it. And I can do this with all the other inputs as well. but just to save a bit of time, I'm going to take the shortcut. And we'll just take a look at what that looks like. So now we switched everything. So the search text is essentially what we just discussed. It has like an additional thing, empty on, where we basically say if the parameter is not present in the URL, the value should be empty string. Likewise, if the value is empty string, we want the parameter to actually be removed from the URL. So this is the default value that I mentioned. We can also model these required amenities. So the difference here is this is actually a multi-select, right? So I can select multiple values that I want to have here. So what I can do is I give it a parameter, I just say multi-true, and now ngqp knows this can actually take on multiple values at the same time. Then of course we have different data types. For example, we have this toggle for whether we want smoking or non-smoking fake hotels. And so we can just say this is a Boolean parameter. Again, we give it the parameter in the URL, and we say the default value is false. And this will actually give us proper Boolean values. And I will ignore this one for now. We can get to this in the end. And so now when we look at this, I actually want to just remove this all. Right, so we've seen how the search works. That's all fine. If I remove it again, the parameter actually disappears entirely because empty string is a default value. The same for the Boolean. So if I select it, since false is the default value, now true is not the default value, therefore it's on the URL. But if I deselect it again, it will be not just moved to false, but actually be removed entirely because that's the default value. And with the amenities, so I can select something and you can see that it adds it as amenity equals breakfast. And if I select the second thing, so the question is how do you encode multiple values in the URL? And that's actually a question ngqp doesn't have to answer because the Angular router already takes care of that by simply repeating that parameter, which I'm told is some kind of standard that apparently the whole world doesn't seem to follow, but yeah. So that's a pretty simple way of doing it. And the last thing that we didn't discuss yet at all is we have to, again, connect this somehow to a backend, right? And the very simple way to do this is our param group that we created exposes an observable just like the Angular forms, and we can simply subscribe to that, or in this case, Switchmap to our API call, and done. And there's actually another little thing that we win here that we didn't have in the original code, which is dealing with race conditions, right? So the API call can take differently long every single time we call it. And by switching to observables with Switchmap, we can actually nicely avoid these calls overtaking each other. So this is nothing from ngqp, this is just RxJS, which that's what it gives us for free. So there's one more case, which is this. I'm going to just clear the URL real quick. So, of course, a very common what happened? Did I type something by accident? No. So like another common thing you want to have is like some kind of sort field where you say, I want to sort by this field. Okay. Am I missing something? Okay, I don't know what happened there, but okay, never mind. So we select both the field and the direction, right? And this is not as easy to map through the URL because ideally we don't want to map this as one single parameter, right? We want to have one parameter for the field and one parameter for the direction. So how can we achieve this? And this is one of the more advanced features that ngqp offers, which is called partitioning. So in this case, we would actually say that we have a partitioned parameter that contains of two separate ones. One is the field that we order by, and one is the direction. They both also have their default value. And now what we need to tell ngqp is, how to combine the two values from the UI into one, and how to split it again, right? So we just give it these two functions, and that way we can achieve that we get exactly what we want. And you can actually see, because we have default values, if I sort by price at all, the sort by field is actually skipped entirely. And if I use the default value for both, it's removed entirely. But if I, for example, go to this one, then you will see both fields. So these are just very quick examples of how ngqp works. There's, of course, a bunch of other features. And of course, there's also a website that explains everything. One of the things I'm most proud of when I wrote the website is that it has these inline examples, which are sort of like an inline browser. So that was really fun to figure out how to do that. There's no fakery going on here on ngqp side. This really uses ngqp. And I can just use this example. And of course, like, it's a fake browser in there, but it actually uses ngqp, so the examples are not fake. And yeah, so there's a bunch of other features that I'm just not going to go into right now too much, but you can see all of these things basically have also examples, including the code and everything. And for the default values, the one thing I want to show is, so what you've seen is we have a default value here, and if we change the slider, we get it on the URL, but whenever we go back to this default value, it disappears. And sometimes maybe that's not what you want to do. Maybe you want to like have a default value when you first open the page, but if you slide it back, you still want it to stay on the URL. And the way you can do that is with one of the core features that I haven't shown, which is you can write your own way of serializing and deserializing values to and from the URL. So you have these string param, number param kind of functions that have default serializers, but you can also just provide your own. So what happens there is you provide these functions and you're saying, for example, if you have a Boolean param status, you know, you don't want it to be status equals true and status equals false, but maybe status equals active and status equals inactive. And the way you do that is you tell it, hey, if you have a value in your component, if it's true, I want it to be active and otherwise inactive. And also, hey, if you're coming from the URL with a value, then if it's false or it's, I mean, not false, if it's not set or if it's active, then I want it to be true and otherwise false, right? So you can just define how to parse this yourself. Okay, and the real quick roadmap. So what's the future of ngqp? So I first gave this talk a long time ago when ngqp was like not quite ready yet. And at the time, there was a bit more concrete things to do. Right now, the two main things basically are, of course, features, 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 right? So features are always good. Although actually at this point, ngqp is pretty mature. So I've had some feature requests that don't work yet, and that would make sense. The most frequently talked about one is somehow encrypting parameters. You can achieve this with serializers yourself as well, but it would be nice to have this baked in. And of course, the other thing right now is it's post version 1, and it hasn't seen too much usage yet. Like, there are a couple of companies using it, but not too much. So feedback is always appreciated. So next time you're writing an Angular application or you see someone writing an Angular application, you know, let them know about ngqp. Tell them how much simpler it makes this task. And so that's basically it. So thank you.